where we are now. So now we're going to do the reaching and grasping, that kind of acting on objects, and then talk about observing other people's actions. So this is a repeat slide just to put us back where we were as we just had started on acting on objects, the reaching and grasping. And started by talking about affordances, that J.J. Gibson gave us this term of for those objects that have a function, of what they kind of afford us with that function, and that can be another really in as far as brain representation to help people remember. And we went through a couple of examples of case studies as well. And your author discusses for a little while here this how much then the communication is going on between the dorsal and ventral pathways as we are acting on objects in the world. And we think of this as kind of a how I'm navigating in the world is the dorsal root, but really those two pathways are for people who are healthy and have don't have the brain damage. Those two streams of information are also communicating with each other quite a bit. So in this case, we're going to look to locate an object. That's going to be the dorsal root. We identify, this is my coffee cup, as I'm going to take my sip of coffee. The identification is the ventral root. I'm going to position my hands and fingers to grasp, which is the dorsal root. I'm going to see on the coffee cup where the handle is, which is going to be the ventral root. I'm going to actually grasp the coffee and lift it to my mouth, which is the dorsal root of navigating. And so they're going back and forth and communicating with each other quite a bit for even the simplest of actions. If we go through the physiology of how this is happening at the dorsal root, the reaching and grasping itself, we have a particular area of the brain called the parietal reach region in the posterior parietal cortex, where neurons are going to fire there in anticipation of reaching for an object, but not in anticipation or not as we are just looking at an object. It is specific to our intention to reach and grasp. So Fattori and colleagues in 2010 looked at neurons. So I don't want to say it was single cell recording because they had several different recorders of these neurons and what they were firing to. And your publishers don't give me the picture of the neural firing, so I'm going to describe it the best that I can. But so the study went like this. The monkey is looking at the fixation light in the dark. The light comes on so the monkey can see the object that he or she has to grasp, and then the lights go back out. And if I remember correctly, I can't see if it's actually, but I think the fixation light changes color to tell them to reach for the object. And what they found was, and so this is one example of an object, this kind of round spherical ball, but they had various objects, different objects that required different kinds of grips. And the book shows some of these, so when you're grasping at something where you have to kind of put your hands around it, I can't explain it differently, or if you're grabbing with, I don't think they have actually one with 2 fingers, but you can imagine there are all different kinds of ways to grasp different objects with different shapes and different handles and so forth. And when they were recording from these neurons, the pattern of firing was different depending on the grasp that the monkey had to have. So different neurons would have their maximal firing for this kind of reaching for and planning to grasp a sphere, and then a different neuron would have the maximal firing for grasping at something that has like a handle to grasp. And I'm hoping that came out as making sense. So the parietal reach region, it's not just about my intention to grasp, but the specific, or to reach, but the specific, it includes the specific grasp that I'm going to make. Different neurons are going to fire for that specific grasp. So we're going to talk about observing other people's actions. And so we get to talk about mirror neurons. I don't know if you knew this was coming up or if you've done this in a lot of classes. I get to talk about mirror neurons in several of my classes, and it's fun because this is an exciting new discovery where we now have to ask the question. So we've discovered these mirror neurons. What is their purpose? What are they doing for us? And we're still doing a lot of research trying to figure that out. Mirror neurons were discovered by Rizzolatti and his colleagues, I want to say in 1996. I'm going to tell the story of the kind of serendipitous result, which is reminiscent of how Hubel and Wiesel discovered those feature detectors in the visual cortex, because not kind of planning where the animal's still hooked up and then they find out, oh wow, this is what those neurons are responding to. So Rizzolatti and his colleagues were doing single cell recording, but from several neurons in the premotor cortex, and they were looking at the monkeys performing specific actions. And one day they had the monkey still hooked up, and the researcher went in and whatever, I think it was, grabbed a peanut, and the monkey's neurons fired just as if the monkey was performing that action, him or herself. So that's how we talk about mirror neurons, that they are responding the same whether you are performing a specific action or whether you're watching someone else perform that action. And your book has this slight rendition there of the firing rate when I'm watching the experimenter pick up the peanut, the firing rate, which has a different type of firing when the monkey's picking up the peanut, him or herself, and then the firing rate when the experimenter is picking up the peanut with pliers, so not using that same reaching and grasping that specific action, using a different action, and you can see there's really not so much neural firing. We also have discovered that there are audio-visual mirror neurons, so if they show the person breaking the peanut and there's a sound, that those neurons are firing. If we show the person breaking the peanut and there's no sound, there's less firing, but the mirror neurons fire because the action is being shown. And even when the monkey just hears the peanut breaking, there is some firing of those neurons, as this is the knowing that that action is occurring and having a kind of visualization of it. I have two links on here, and I've stopped showing the top link, but it's in, so if you go into these PowerPoints, you can go in and find it if you're really interested in mirror neurons. It's a little bit old and it's been chopped into two parts. It used to be available through PBS, but now I've gone out and found it on YouTube years later. They do have that suggestion that potentially people with autism spectrum disorder have a broken mirror neuron system, that they talk about that for a little bit. But so this is old enough to say that does not appear to be true, and but it's still an interesting video if you kind of want to see some of the history of what we've gone through, of what we think these mirror neurons are doing for us. And it's a neat video. What I'm going to ask you to watch, and what I'm going to put the link for, is this TED Talk by V.S. Ramachandran. And if I work out my timing correctly, I'm going to end up asking the questions, and then you're going to have to go watch the TED Talk. So I'll have you write that question down so that you're thinking about it, because he discusses the possible purpose of mirror neurons very differently than a lot of other people do. And I think it's a good thing to think through of what do we think these mirror neurons are giving us, are allowing for us to do or to learn or to understand of people. And I'm going to go through several studies from the textbook that are really looking at different possibilities for the answer to that question. So in the Pierno et al. Study that I'm thinking of, I'm hoping this is the one that I'm describing here that's in the textbook and it all matches up, that there's participants were looking at basically a cartoon animated female, and she was either looking straight forward, looking at, and then she goes to grab an object, or she just looks over at the object, really as if she might interact with that object in some way. And what they found was that there were neurons in the premotor cortex that were firing in response to not just her actually going and grabbing the object, but the intention to go grab the object, so that when she looks at the object, we see some firing of those mirror neurons. And Pierno talks about this as an action observation system, the mirror neuron system, where we have similar activity, whether someone is actually doing the specific behavior or if they're just looking at it and we're assuming something about their intentions to perform that behavior. Okay, so Iacoboni and colleagues looked at this question of intention in a different kind of way. So they had the control films where they were really just showing the context, and you can kind of see, I hope you can see that there's before T and then after T where there's kind of things have been drunk a bit and there's a bit of a mess. They had a control film that showed just the action without the context. And then they had an intention film. So in one, they're going to be, the intention is, because it's following the before T or has that same kind of scene as the before T, it suggests that the person is going to drink. And then because the one on the bottom is the after T and it's kind of a mess, this suggests that the person is more likely cleaning up. Okay, and if we look at the data of the activity of the mirror neurons, that in the action film where the person is still performing the action, those neurons are firing less than in the case of cleaning up. And in the case of cleaning up, they're firing more than in just the action film, but they're firing less than when the intention is to drink. The mirror neurons are firing the strongest or the fastest when the person is intending to drink. So they interpreted this really as the intention is important for the mirror neuron response, and that we are assuming things. We are learning about someone's intentions. So far, I'm pretty sure all of the studies that I have just talked about were recording from the premotor cortex, and that is where mirror neurons were originally discovered, so up in the frontal lobes, up in front of the motor cortex, that premotor cortex area. But since then, they have discovered mirror neurons in several areas of the cortex. You don't need to know all of these, but just so that you see that they are all over the cortex. That turquoise light blue color is movements towards objects. The purple at the top that we see is the reaching movements, so you can see the posterior parietal for the parietal reach region. The orange is when we have tool use, so that's more towards the temporal lobes. The green movements that are not directed towards objects, and then that strip of blue down there is upper arm or upper limb movements. And I used to ask a question, and I sometimes still do, but sometimes I switch things around, of where those mirror neurons were originally discovered. Because when I first taught this class, I asked where there were mirror neurons, and that was back in 2012. And from what I knew back then, they were in the premotor cortex, but some students would write different things of different areas of the cortex. I don't know if they were guessing or if they actually knew something about mirror neurons. I have no idea. But when I'd go and look that up just to check, they were already discovering them in other areas. So I switched the question to say, where were they discovered? Because they really have been discovered all over the cortex now. As far as I know and understand, that we have not figured out that they are in subcortical areas, but we'll see if we ever. It sounds like they're in the cortex and in various areas of the cortex. So I'm going to describe a study conducted by Beatriz Calvo Moreno, can't really say her name very well, back in 2005, where she had people watch capoeira dancing, which I'm showing down there on the left. I just got these pictures off of the internet, but what I'm trying to show with them is that it has these martial arts aspects to the dancing. And participants also watched ballet, so being shown down on the bottom right. And then the people who were participants were, some were capoeira dancers that didn't dance ballet, some were ballet dancers that didn't dance capoeira, and some were not dancers. Okay, so these are the results from the Calvo Moreno study, where she was examining activity in the premotor cortex, where those mirror neurons were originally discovered. And if you look at the red bars on this figure, you can see that if they were watching ballet, okay, the ballet dancers had a higher percent signal change than the capoeira dancers or the control, significantly higher. If we look at the blue bars, that is the response to watching capoeira dancing. And the capoeira dancers now have the most signal change and significantly more than the ballet dancers or the controls. And my memory is that ballet dancers watching capoeira, capoeira dancers watching ballet, and controls that do not dance, that those are not, none of those are significantly different from each other. So her conclusion was that these mirror neurons are shaped by experience. So I usually have my green question here, and this is, sometimes it generates some discussion, and sometimes I get a little bit of silence, but I do want you to stop and think, and you might want to pause it, although I'm going to leave that silence in there for you to think for at least a moment about what are these mirror neurons responding to. We've looked at several different studies, whether it was looking at intentions or the that kind of action observation system, that idea, watching somebody perform something that I perform, those audio-visual mirror neurons when we're listening to the peanut crack or the piano. So all of that. And then also, not only what are they responding to, since we're seeing them respond to these various scenarios, but what is their purpose for us? And we might say it for other animals as well, since these were discovered in monkeys. Okay, so when students are engaged and really interested in this question, they gravitate towards different answers. And a lot of people say social learning, this idea that we can learn vicariously by watching someone else. Some people feel pretty strongly about that idea of their being involved in our sense of empathy and feeling for other people. And other people talk about the importance of figuring out other people's intentions and our kind of response, how we respond. So this really kind of social, being able to handle our social situations. And I think, so I'm kind of hoping that my pauses here are places where you're thinking about this yourself a little bit, and I hope you did pause it, and that you did watch the Ramachandran, because he's clearly feels that this has to do with, the sophisticated mirror neuron system has to do with our sense of empathy, and potentially hinting on that theory of mind. But one of the reasons I pause here is that I think this is one of those areas that show what an open field a lot of this research is. That it's very exciting that just like back when Hubel and Wiesel discovered those simple cells and complex cells, people got very excited about what these meant for putting together visual information. As back then we used to talk about these really feature-driven theories because they had discovered these feature detectors. So we're in the middle of that excitement now with mirror neurons. We're not, the researchers aren't sure. We don't know exactly what their purpose is, or and we're finding they're responding to various aspects of watching other people perform these activities. So I think it's a kind of fun thing to think about, kind of like the question of the social pain and how much is that overlapping with physical pain, because it is something that they are still trying to figure out. I always think that's really exciting. So I'm slipping this final slide in here to just remind you to go watch the Ramachandran talk, but not just to remind you to watch that because it's there in Blackboard, but to also remind you to think about the questions that, and to maybe just go back and look at the different studies that I've talked about so far and what they have found mirror neurons responding to, what they respond more strongly to, because it is a question of what are they responding to and what is their purpose really. And so Ramachandran has a really different idea than anybody who I've talked about so far. And I really do want you to think about this question of what is their purpose. We've discovered them in monkeys. We clearly have a sophisticated mirror neuron system. What is this giving us in our relationship with the world and our relationships with each other?